morning. India and UK have resumed talks on a comprehensive trade deal aiming to more than double bilateral trade in the next decade. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal and UK Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds made the announcement in New Delhi yesterday. The discussions come amid global economic uncertainties, including tariff threats from US President Donald Trump. Now, despite challenges, both nations are pushing towards what they call a path-breaking free trade agreement and an investment treaty. But there is no deadline yet on when this FTA will finally come through. Piyush Goyal expressed confidence that the deal could boost merchandise trade towards the two countries and between the two countries by up to 2 to 3 times over the next 10 years. Now, bilateral trade in goods and services between India and the UK currently stands at about $41 billion. Remember, talks had been paused since March 2023 but gained fresh momentum after discussions between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer at the G20 Summit in Rio de Janeiro last year. Now, just to give some context on these renewed talks between India and UK to advance free trade negotiations. Now, the countries are trying to eliminate and reduce customs on maximum goods. The FTA to ease norms to promote trade and investments is under discussion. UK-India FTA negotiations started way back in 2022 in the month of Jan. It's been almost 3 years and we haven't yet been able to even set a deadline. The UK is India's 6th largest investor in India, but UK happens to be India's 11th largest trading partner. The UK has invested just about $35 billion through FDI in India in the last 25 years or so. Now, as far as bilateral trade between the two countries is concerned, the bilateral trade for the financial year 2022-23 stood at about $20.3 billion, which grew just slightly to about $21.3 billion last year. Now, joining me on the show to discuss how near or how far we are from the FTA and what exactly is a free trade agreement is Barnik Chitran Mehta, Managing Partner, Chrysalis Equity Ventures. Barnik, good morning. Thank you for being here with us on News9. First up, just explain to us how exactly is a free trade agreement different from any other trade agreement?
No, a free trade agreement by its definition is an agreement which promotes more seamless, I would say, transit of goods and services between two countries. What typically happens in a free trade agreement is that preferential tariffs or different kinds of import duties are levied versus the standard import duties. So typically within a free trade ambit, a lot of goods which are part of the import-export norm between two countries are actually taxed at different rates between these two countries than it would be taxed otherwise. So if you take the example of India, right, a free trade agreement for India with the UK would mean that there would be lower tariffs or import duties on goods UK wants to sell to India, and vice versa for whatever goods and services India wants to sell to the UK, there would be a far more preferential tariff norm. Now, the agreement not only covers tariffs, but it would cover other elements, usually like regulation, social security, labor movement norms, and also things which is a stickler for the India-UK deal, a legal recourse and arbitration. So a free trade agreement, while seeking to boost trade between two countries, covers not only preferential tariffs, but a host of other issues, including legal matters and labor and human capital matters.
Okay, so let's talk about tariffs for a while. And tariff, as Donald Trump himself has said, is his 4th favorite word. And right now we can't really live in an environment without discussing trade in the context of what we are seeing coming by way of the US and its President Donald Trump. Now, is it not obviously in the interest of the entire world to go ahead and stitch up more FTAs given the tariff threats that the US is threatening the entire world with?
Yeah, I think that's correct. If you look at India, right, we just discussed that UK is the 11th largest trading partner, whereas the US, for example, is the top 3 trading partner, right? Just in terms of numbers, our annual trade figures with the US are at north of $150 billion versus with the UK, it's somewhere between 30, 40, 50 billion, depending on what you count, right?
Right.
Now, if you look at the sizes of the two economies, India is the 5th largest economy, the UK is the 6th largest economy. The UK does not manufacture and produce a lot of goods and services. And India also needs a lot of higher value added manufacturing products and services. So there's a much natural fit between the two countries to do far more trade. So if you look at just the numbers, I think we can easily do 2 to 3 times of the number we are doing today. And why in a decade? I think this can be easily achieved within 5 years, right? If we get some of the issues sorted, which are not just on the tariff rates, but also some subtler issues on visa, rules of origination, and arbitration.
So let's just spend a minute talking about the other FTAs that India has been able to crystallize. And in fact, Ursula von der Leyen is expected to be in India later this week and has a meeting scheduled with Prime Minister Modi. So if you talk about India and the European Union, there is a free trade agreement of about $100 billion in the making by 2030, if I remember correctly. If you talk about India and Switzerland, we are looking at by 2035 having our trade volume go up to about $150 billion. But UK still continues to be, it might be the 11th largest trading partner, but the volume still seems to be fairly small, Barnik. So do we really need trade with UK to grow up? Is that on India's main priority bucket, or is India's real concern with the delay in the UK issuing visas to Indians?
So if you look at the Indian point of view, they've actually bucketed these ideas together, right? I think from the UK point of view, I think doing more trade with India is important for them, particularly now that they're out of the European Union construct, right? I think that means that they need to have free trade agreements with other European Union partners. So I think the imperative on UK to do the trade agreements is far higher because they, as you have flashed on screen, they're demanding lower tariffs on several products like whiskey, scotch, automotive components, aerospace components, lamps, chocolates, and confectionery, which I think are taxed quite exorbitantly. And for them, that's an important factor because it gives a fillip to the UK. If you look at the UK as an economy, right, this is not an economy which is growing robustly or does not have the same growth profile as a US and UK growth profile. There is a lot of idle manufacturing and service capacity which needs to be utilized globally, right? For the UK, hence exporting more of its goods and including services. In fact, there's a demand from the UK to actually create more level playing field when it comes to other areas like banking services, legal services, as well as services in telecom and technology, which just ensures that they have far more greater demand to supply to. In fact, one of the sticking points is UK is also requesting for an access to bid for government procurement projects, right?
That's
so this
right.
is one of the requests. So if you look at the UK point of view, I think India needs, they need India a lot. Even from India's point of view, we have set an export target of $1 trillion, right? If you have to get to an export target of $1 trillion, right, you have to double or triple your trade or exports with several trading partners like the UK, right? But from India's point of view, any trade deal also means simpler visa norms for not only IT workers, but also healthcare workers. Healthcare workers are a big export India does to the UK. There's also a request for social security protection for workers who are going under intercompany norms. So again, if you look at what the objectives are, I think the UK is far more interested in exporting services and goods to India. India is far more interested on visa. Also very interested in expanding FDI investment from UK into India, while from 2020 they've done $30 billion. But if you look at the last 12 to 18 months, the net FDI may be negative. So I think both parties have different motives, right? Which is why this free trade agreement will be an FTA plus if it gets signed, addressing some of the concerns both on the India side, but also as well as on the UK side.
But Barnik, talking about visas, do you think it really is something that the UK should consider a little more seriously, given that it is not among the fastest growing economies by any measure of calculation, and hence it would need more people to come into the country and work? And now that they have the Labour Party in power in the UK, what is really holding UK back by a quicker and more agile way of addressing the visa issue with India?
So immigration and visa have become hot topic issues in Europe, right? In general, if you look at the rightward shift in Europe, and UK actually bucked the trend in appointing a left government, right? I think in general, immigration has lost popular appeal amongst the masses, right? So having immigration which is liberal, like it was 8-10 years back, is hard to prove. Even in the current environment, if you look at the backlash the Labour government has faced with a lot of internal scams and I would say some of the law and order issues associated with immigrants, I find it hard to believe that there'll be a complete U-turn on the limited immigration policy.
Okay.
I think one of the things UK has is actually a fairly straightforward and transparent visa system. They've implemented points, and they're very clear what kind of workers they actually need, right? I think the discussion there is to just ensure that instead of giving the house away on visas, which is unlikely, right, which they will do, I think the UK may accede to coming up with some norms to ease some of the stringent requirement, but I don't see a scenario in which, even though it's a Labour government, that they're going to go back all the way to what the visa norms were. So I think the visa is a little bit of a wish list. I think there will be some informal assurances given. But if you look at from India's point of view, one of the biggest challenges beyond visa, which I think is a win they would like to take, is if you look at textile and apparel,
Right.
which is the first category of exports we give. UK has a very stringent carbon tax and also stringent
That's right.
sustainability norms, which makes our apparel quite uncompetitive, right?
Right.
I think in an ideal scenario, I don't see an explicit deal on visas, but maybe the UK will give way on sustainability and carbon tax on textiles in return for lower tariffs on goods. But I think the visa is an ongoing discussion.
Sure.
And I think it's there on the table. I don't expect it to get resolved as part of the FDA deal.
Okay.
But I do expect a little bit more laxity than what was administered in the previous Conservative government.
All right. And one final question. I'm not sure if you'll have an estimate of an answer for that or not. But if a guesstimate was to be made, Barnik, there's no deadline set by either government on when this FTA will come through. This is the 15th meeting in about 3 years that is being held on FTA between the two sides. How far are we from the FTA actually coming through?
So listen, the folly of the 2022 negotiations was the Diwali deadline, right? I think as people have pointed out, I think the deadline itself was one of the reasons why the talks collapsed, right? While I wouldn't bet money on a deadline, given the fact that the European Union is also coming to, if need be, to renegotiate its FTA, right? And given the unreasonable asks the US counterparts may have, right, from an Indian point of view on whatever free trade deal they sign with the US, the environment today is very different from 2022. I don't think there's any impending elections on both countries.
Right.
I think India has a higher imperative to sign the trade deal because bilateral investments from the UK are actually held up in the absence of certain concessions on arbitration.
Right.
I would be I'm cautiously optimistic for a deal before end of the year, right? Given all the geopolitics, right? Bar all the geopolitics, I would just view it as yet another news. But given everything that's going on around us, I think there's increased urgency on both sides to get a deal done, given particularly what's happening in the geopolitics between US and increasingly what may happen with China going forward.
All right, Barnik, let's leave it at that. Barnik, they're cautiously optimistic that by end of the year, we may have a UK-India free trade agreement. Let's leave it at that for now. Barnik, thank you so much for joining us this morning.